Today, I will be talking about our investigation into P-wave or malicious code signing, focusing on how attackers are abusing code signing certificates. Let us begin. This research was conducted by 3 security researchers from NTT Security, Shogo, Rinto, and myself, Yuta. We work in the Security Operations Center, SOC, where we are responsible for log analysis, malware analysis, and threat research. In this talk, I, Yuta, will present our findings. Our research focusing on code signing certificates. Code signing is widely used in the software industry. The purpose of this is to show the software's publisher and to confirm that it has been issued by a legitimate organization. Additionally, it serves to verify that the software has not been tampered with since the time it was signed. As shown in this figure, by viewing a file's properties on Windows, you can access information such as the publisher of the signature and the timestamp when it was signed. In the past, signed malware was rare and only used in very limited cases. However, in recent years, signed malware has been used not only in APT attacks, but also in financially motivated attacks. Therefore, even if software is signed, it does not necessarily mean it is safe to execute. So, how do attackers obtain code signing certificates? One common method has been stealing certificates from organizations that already possess them. By stealing a certificate from a legitimate organization, attackers can sign their malware, making it appear as legitimate software. However, recently, there has been an increase in cases where attackers purchase certificates themselves. Code signing certificates are traded for high prices on the dark web, and there is an active market for stealing them. One of the attack campaigns that uses signed malware involves MSIX files. MSIX is a new Windows app package format. MSIX files require signature verification at runtime, and samples without a valid signature cannot be executed. As a result, malicious MSIX file providers often collaborate with sellers of code signing certificates in the market. This is a post made by a certificate seller on the dark marketplace. It claims that using signed malware can bypass detection by Windows Smart Screen, browsers, and antivirus products. Additionally, the Baltic states and the UK are listed as the origin countries for the certificate they issue. Here's a price list provided by the certificate sellers. They claim to be able to obtain organization validation and extended validation certificates from various certificate authorities. The price of the certificate varies depending on the type and the issuing authority. We have been investigating MSX files submitted to an online sample sharing site for over a year. In this session, I will share the insights we gained regarding the relationship between the certificates used and the MSX files. This figure highlights a specific certificate and shows a timeline of MSX files signed with that certificate. The red circles represent the submitted MSX files, with the upper portion showing the submission times and the lower portion showing the file names. Focusing on the submission times, we can see that the first sample was submitted in late January, with intermittent submissions continuing until mid-March. This indicates that samples using a single certificate were used over the course of several months. Additionally, as shown by the file names, each sample is disguised as legitimate software. The file names range from AI tools to browsers and various utility tools, reflecting a wide variety of disguises. Among the samples we analyzed, we found an interesting case. The certificate which is used to sign the MSX files had already been used to sign non-MSX samples. This happened even before any of the MSX files were submitted. On the timeline, the blue circles represent these earlier samples. Many of the certificates exploited in this attack were specifically created for this attack campaign. So most of the samples signed with these certificates are related to MSX files. However, these blue test samples have not related to this attack campaign. We refer to these earlier samples as test samples. Through our investigation of numerous malicious MSX files, we observed several of these test samples and identified common characteristics among them. First, the test samples are legitimate. As you can see from the file names, various software has been used as test samples, and these files have been signed with certificates that were not originally associated with them. The content of the test samples is legitimate, and these test samples are not flagged as malicious on the online sample sharing site. The second characteristic is that the test samples are submitted prior to the MSIX files. There may be a single test sample or multiple ones, but in all cases, they are submitted in batches within a short period of time. In some cases, test samples are submitted several months before the MSIX files. This suggests that their certificates were created and used to sign test samples long before they were utilized in the MSIX files. The third characteristic is that some of the test samples were submitted by the same uploader. This timeline shows the samples submitted by a specific uploader. A total of 6 test samples were submitted, 3 of which were signed with one certificate, while the other 3 were signed with a different certificate. Both certificates were later found to be abused for signing MSX files. What's particularly noteworthy is that these 6 samples were submitted in rapid succession, suggesting that these test samples were intentionally submitted by the same individual. To uncover what these samples are and who is submitting them, we conducted a large-scale investigation. By March 2024, we had collected over 300 malicious MSX files that have been submitted. We then gathered the certificates used in these samples and investigated whether any test samples have been submitted. As a result, we identified 24 certificates and 18 test samples. The figure on the left shows a word cloud of the strings used in the file names of the MSIX files. The attackers disguised the malicious MSIX files as various types of software, such as browsers, conferencing tools, and AI-related tools, in an effort to deceive users into installing them. The table on the right lists the files signed by the certificates. There is a noticeable bias in the legitimate software used as test samples, with PuTTY and 7-zip is being particularly common. We collected 24 certifications, and among them, 7 had test samples submitted. This table highlights only the certificates with test sample submissions. For information on other certificates, please refer to our paper. In this figure, the left end of the blue bars represents the time when the test files were submitted, and the right end shows the time when the first MSIX files were submitted. The right graph indicates the uploader of the test samples. Some of the certificates had test samples submitted by the same uploader. For example, Certificate 11 and 14 were submitted by uploader A from Canada, while Certificates 20 and 22 were submitted by uploader E from UK. The test samples signed with different certificates are submitted at the same time, but the timing of when the MSIX files are submitted varies. In our investigation, we found that for each certificate, there was only one uploader submitting the test samples. Additionally, there were no cases where these uploaders submit MSIX files. This brings us to the main focus of our presentation. We focused on the files submitted by uploader E. This uploader submitted 5 different PuTTY files, and each of these files was signed with a different certificate. Among them, file 2 and 3 were signed with the certificates mentioned earlier in the table. And we have observed MSIX files signed with these certificates. However, the other 3 certificates have not been observed yet. So, will these certificates remain unused? No. There is a strong possibility that they will be used in future attacks. At this point, we formulated a hypothesis. By focusing on known uploaders and identifying other unknown test samples they submit, we might be able to predict certificates which could be abused in the future. We will continue our investigation to see if this hypothesis can be proven. The challenge here lies in how to find the unknown test samples. Unfortunately, there is no method provided to search for samples submitted by specific uploaders. However, we have identified several characteristics of the test samples that can aid in that discovery. First, the submission times are often concentrated within a short time frame. There is a possibility that undiscovered test samples are hidden among the samples submitted shortly before or after the known test samples. Additionally, as shown earlier, there is a bias in the legitimate software used for the test samples. By investigating whether files with the same software but different signatures have been submitted, we can use file names and file similarities such as SSDIP and TLSH. In this way, it is certainly possible to discover previously unknown test samples. We extended our investigation for an additional month and collected new MSIX files submitted in April 2024. As a result, we discovered 10 new certificates and we confirmed that 6 of them had test samples submitted. Interestingly, the time between the signing of these certificates and their abuse had lengthened. In particular, certificate number 29 had a delay of more than 6 months before the submission of MSX file samples. Among these 6 certificates, we identified that uploader D and E were already known to submit test samples from our previous investigation. This means that we could have predicted the abuse of the remaining 4 certificates based on their association with known test sample uploaders. By reviewing uploader E's timeline, we can see that all the certificates we predicted would be abused were indeed used in this attack. In this way, by focusing on the known uploader and identifying new test samples they submit, it is possible to predict which certificates will be abused in advance. Let's take a moment to summarize the insights we've gained regarding the test samples. First, who is submitting these test samples? The answer is the certificate sellers. There's no other party capable of submitting samples signed with different certificates within such a short time frame. The purpose is likely to prove the attackers purchasing the signatures that the certificates are undetectable by anti-OS products and not being reused. Next, the average time between the submission of a test sample and the MSX file was 75.3 days. The Ys of the blue bars in the area figure represents this time difference. As you can see, the time between creation and actual abuse varies from certificate to certificate. This suggests that the sellers are not creating certificates on demand for attackers, but instead they create a large number of certificates in advance. They keep a pool of certificates and sell them to customers based on their preferences. As a result, multiple certificates are created and tested at the same time, but the timing of when each certificate is sold and abused for signature malware varies. Therefore, if we can predict which certificates will be abused and revoke them during this time window, we have the potential to disrupt the entire attack campaign. In other words, if we can identify test samples and predict which certificate will be abused within the 75.3-day window, revoking those certificates would render them unusable for attackers, leading their attacks to fail. When a certificate is revoked, its information is added to the certificate revocation list CRL and distributed widely through the certificate authority. As a result, any MSX files signed with the revoked certificate will fail verification at runtime and will no longer be installable. In practice, the execution screen displays an error code indicating that the certificate verification has failed. In other words, predicting and revoking the certificates that are likely to be abused can serve as a highly effective countermeasure against this attack campaign. Next, let's look at the characteristics of the abused certificates. In total, including the additional investigation, we collected 34 certificates. Many of these certificates were issued by well-known CAs, with SSL.com being the most prominent. All of these certificates had different signers registered. Although there was no uniformity in the size or industry of the organization involved, we did observe a few common features. First, the validity period of all certificates was set to 1 year. Second, the signers were legitimate companies registered with public authorities. Lastly, these companies were all private limited companies with at least 3 years having passed since their incorporation. Moreover, when looking at the certificates issued by the most common CA in our data, the majority of the subject country codes were from the UK. It means GB. This may be related to the earlier observation of the UK uploader submitting test samples. Additionally, it was confirmed that all signers were registered with company house. So, how are certificate sellers obtaining these certificates? First, there is a theory that they are exploiting stolen certificates from legitimate organizations. However, this doesn't seem to be the case here. The reason is that the abused certificates share common characteristics, and most of the signed files are either MSX or test files. No other files signed with these certificates have been observed, further supporting this conclusion. Next, there's a possibility that attackers are creating shell companies to obtain their certificates. But this also doesn't apply to this case. The organizations registered as signers are all legitimate companies, and more than 3 years have passed since their incorporation. Furthermore, these organizations have active websites that use SSL certificates issued by different CAs. Given these factors, setting up a shell company solely to obtain certificates would likely be too costly. Finally, there is a theory that the sellers are impersonating real legitimate companies to acquire their certificates. This is considered the most likely scenario in this case. As mentioned earlier, we investigated how the most frequently abused CA issues certificates. All of the abused certificates from this CA are OV certificates and are registered with company's house. With this CA for OV certificates, if a company has been registered for more than 3 years, they will issue a certificate as long as there is a link proving the company's existence. Though there is a form-based identity verification, it can be substituted with SMS verification, making it easier for attackers to bypass the identity verification process. Given this, it is highly likely that the certificate sellers are impersonating legitimate companies and obtaining certificates without the company's knowledge. Finally, let's consider countermeasures against this attack campaign from the perspective of certificates. We have collected certificates used to sign malicious MSX files, and by reporting them to the certificate authority, it is possible to revoke these certificates. This is cause the installation of the MSX files to fail, thereby also rendering other MSX files signed with the same certificates invalid. However, it is challenging to request the revocation of certificates that have a high potential for future abuse. Without concrete evidence of misuse, it is unlikely that CAs will accept such requests. Therefore, for files signed with these certificates, an effective countermeasure would be to restrict execution using app locker. This will help prevent the installation of the potentially malicious files signed with those certifications. In line with our environment to responsible disclosure, we have been promptly reporting any abuse certificates to the relevant CAs as soon as they are discovered in our research. We will continue this practice to ensure that any future findings are addressed immediately. To conclude this presentation, in this research, we investigated an attack campaign utilizing MSIX files and uncovered the realities of its ecosystem. We revealed that certificate servers and conducting verification process using test samples, allowing us to predict which certificates are likely to be abused months in advance. During our analysis of the corrected certificates, we found a high probability that certificate servers are impersonating legitimate companies to obtain certifications. This highlights issues in the identity verification process conducted by CS, suggesting that attackers can easily impersonate others to acquire code signing certificates. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.